Crazy. Hope everybody's having a good week, a healthy week, and if you need to be healthy or you need a refuah, may Hashem use the merit of our Talmud Torah tonight for the purposes of a merit for refuah for everybody who needs it, whether you're on the call, whether we know the name or not. So tonight, I want to acknowledge the generous sponsorship of tonight's Shiur. Thank you very much to Stuart and Danielle Turk, who are sponsoring in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Stuart's father, Israel Turkenitz, Zichrono Livracha. May his neshama have an aliyah, and may Stuart, Daniel, your whole extended family be blessed with long life and good health. So we've transitioned from Sefer Breshit to Parshat Shemot to Sefer Shemot. As I mentioned in some of my remarks in shul, in my drasha, Sefer Breshit is perhaps characterized by it being a narrative, a collection of stories of individuals. It really is the power of the individual. The book is filled with many individual stories, meaning of Adam and Chava and Noah and Avram, Sarah, Yitzhak, but it's story of individuals and particular parts of their lives. Sefer Shemot begins differently. Sefer Shemot is no longer just the story of individuals or even a family. And close to the beginning of Parshat Shemot, the Torah tells us that the Jewish people are no longer even identified as simply a large family. Yaakov and his family, of course, went to Eretz Mitzrayim, but they went as a family, an extended family. There may have been 70 or more people in the family, but it was seen as a family, as a unit. But already right at the beginning of Parshat Shemot, the Torah tells us, and we'll take a look at this pasuk. I'm looking at Perek Aleph, pasuk Chet. Vayakom melech chadash al Mitzrayim asher lo yada et Yosef. That a new king, and reading from the Stone Translation interpretation, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Yosef. Now, before we get into that pasuk, I just want to point out the next pasuk, and one of the words that's critical in terms of understanding the transition from the collection of narratives about individuals in Sefer Breshit to Sefer Shemot. Vayomer el amo, Paro speaks to his nation, and what does he say? Hine am b'nei Yisrael, rav v'atzum mimenu. And Paro said to his people, behold, the people, the children of Israel. That's the first time that b'nei Yisrael are now called an am. Interesting, though that word comes from the mouth of a person not a member of the tribe. It comes from the mouth of Paro. But the point is, of course, that Paro recognizes this is no longer just a collection of people. It's not one big family. It's not Yaakov's family, children and grandchildren. This is now a nation. So let's go back to Pasuk Chet and take a look at this idea. Vayakom melech hadash, a new king. And I think we're familiar with the machloket that Rashi quotes between Rav and Shmuel. What does it mean, a new king? And there are two opinions that are quoted. A new king means exactly that. It is a new king. The king that was alive at the time that Yaakov and his family had come to Egypt, the king that was alive at the time that Yosef rose to his position of leadership, is no longer alive. Vayakom melech hadash, a new king arose. But the other opinion is no, it's the same individual. However, as the opinion quoted in Rashi says, but nitchadshu gzeirotav. It's not a new person. It's the same person, but something about this person has changed. He now issues and proclaims new rules, a new attitude. There's a new zeitgeist in Egypt. Now, we did speak a little bit last week about the possibility that some of these changes have perhaps already been in play by the end of Sefer Breshit. We talked about that. We talked about Yosef having to ask permission from Paro to take his father and burying him. We noticed that as the Torah describes that sort of request, Yosef isn't even going himself. He's asking the servants of Paro to speak on his behalf. Why would that be the case? And one suggestion is because apparently there's been already a change in Yosef's elevated status. He's not quite so elevated. And maybe there were people within the entourage of the royal palace who weren't really such fans of or supporters of Yosef. We suggested that. Maybe there were people who didn't like the fact that a Hebrew slave was elevated to be in charge of everybody. Maybe there were people who didn't like the fact that as part of his economic plan, Yosef sold the entire population of Egypt into slavery to be indentured servants to Paro. So maybe there are people here, maybe Paro's himself, one of them whose attitudes have changed. But let's just take a pause for a second and think about that. And I want to share with you an insight by Rabbi Yehuda Leib Chasman. Rabbi Yehuda Leib Chasman was born in 1869. He died in 1936. He was born in Eastern Europe, but he ended up making Aliyah and becoming the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshiva Hebron. He died in 1936. And he offers an interesting insight into this idea of Melech Hadash that I want to explore with you and perhaps consider its implications. Rabbi Chasman wants to understand, how does it happen? How does it happen? According to the opinion that Paro is in fact the same Paro. He's not a different Paro. It's not that the old Paro died and a new Paro was born. The new Paro was born. Maybe there could be some sort of gap. But the same man who had a dream, the same man who's turned to Yosef and said, you are an extraordinary man, there's no one like you, and I want you to help, and I want you to save the entire country of Egypt. And he handed over the reins of so much power to Yosef. How does a man like that simply stop remembering all of the things that Yosef had done? How is it possible? And not only that, there's an interesting midrash that we haven't spoken about, but that when it became clear that Paro needed a change, it was his, or the national policy towards the Jewish people needed to change. There were forces within the inner circle of the palace who were pushing for some sort of final solution to the Jewish problem. And Paro himself resisted it. And they deposed him for 3 months. There's a midrash that Paro was deposed. Why? Because he was defended Yosef and the Jewish people. And this alienated the inner circle of rule of power inside the palace of Egypt. This is the midrash speaking, until Paro was sort of at some point either convinced or changed his own mind, and the policy obviously publicly did change. But should that be the case, we have sources, we have sort of a perspective that suggests that Paro is not this man who's without memory, and he's not also a man who's without sympathy. And yet here he is, Vayakam Melech Hadash. How does that happen? So Rabbi Chasman offers an explanation, not, I think, going to the depths of psychological interpretation, but suggests something about human nature. And then maybe many of us can relate to this. And he suggests, and I'll read the first part of the sentence, Lamadnu mikan mahem kochot nafsho shel adam. From this verse, which tells us just how dramatic a change Paro underwent, we learn something about the nature of psychology of a human being and just how intense or powerful a person's emotions or psychological perceptions can be. Shebizman katzar yachol lihitgalgel b'madron nora me'orach chaim lamala lamaskil. That was a very short period of time. Within a short period of time, a person can change like that from being a person of awareness and understanding, ad reddit she'omata, and to drop himself from a height to indescribable depths of lowness. Meaning, from going, this is what he says, is there some man in Egypt who has the understanding of the Spirit of God? Of course, he's referring to the story in Sefer Breshit of how he identified Yosef as that man moved by some sort of spirit that could possibly save Egypt. Ad lehava nitchak malo. How does it happen? How does it happen? So I don't know how it happens, and he doesn't say how it happens. What sort of mental or psychological gymnastics a person has to go through to change. I think human history has seen that. I think those of us who read enough about Holocaust literature can see how could a country, which was the seat of culture, of music and art and opera and symphonic creations, how could it be that that country became the country that we now refer to as Nazi Germany? How does that happen? But it does happen. It happened now and it happened then. And it happened quickly. The Torah doesn't give us this notion of impression of it happening over a long period of time. It goes from one pasuk to the next. That's it. It happens. And don't be surprised at the speed in which it happens, because that's human nature. That's the human beast. The human beast changes and quickly transforms from that to the other. And if you want to know how it happens, that's how it happens. And so maybe the point is here, watch out. Don't put all your trust into man. It's an interesting possible lesson. It's a pessimistic lesson. It's a sad lesson. It's a lesson just to be careful. Just to be careful. And who better than the Jewish people know that lesson? Certainly within the modern era. Who more than us understands that within a short period of time, you can be alienated. In a short period of time, you can be pushed to the periphery. In a short period of time, you can be demonized. And as somebody's pointing in the chat, is the modern state of Israel certainly is that. But then he posits something which I think just bears reflection. And I don't know if he's right about this, but he says this, and I'm explaining it this way. If you believe that, if you are convinced in the description that I've just shared with you, which is Rabbi Chasman's description, if you believe that it's possible to go from the height to the depth, from being the hero to the anti-hero, if you can be perceived so quickly in one way and change, then why not accept that it goes the other way? Avon idach isa, he says, but from the other perspective, the other side, is what? Sheyesh bekoach adam lihit'alot v'lavo b'derech hayim af im yimatzeh b'shafel madriga. It works the other way. Just like you have to believe that you can drop from the height to the depth, if that sort of transformation can happen, says Rabbi Chasman, then believe the other way, that a person can be at the lowest rung, but also ascend. You do not have to stay at the bottom. And then he goes on to speak, I think, very critically of those people who say, this is just my nature. There's nothing I can do about it. This is who I am. That's me. You can't expect more from me than this. That's how I was born. This is how I've always been. And he says, baloney, you're lazy. You're lazy. That's the whole reason that you're staying like that. Vayakom melech hadash cannot only be used to make us feel victimized. Yes, look what happened to the Jewish people. We were the victim of this sort of topsy-turvy world. Never us, victims. It says if you believe that, and only that, then you're cutting the story. Mikan nimtza stirat kol binyanam shel ta'anat hamon b'nei adam yoshvei choshech v'tzal mavet. And this is the sort of the position that those people who wish to choose to dwell in darkness, this is what they make, that's what they say. Motzi'im anacham milibam, they're krachzing, oy, nebech, as, v'omrim, and they say, ma'uchal asad, what can I do? Tiv'i ukach, this is just my nature, I can't change. Efshar li lishanot, I can't change my nature. Paro changed his nature. Paro changed. But Paro is a human being. We may not like him, but he is a human being given to the same sort of forces and influences as all human beings. If Paro, then us. Just like Paro could make that switch, so can we. Meaning, you cannot claim that you are at the place you are in your life because that's your lot and you can't change. Yes, you can. But he says that the people who choose not to change, they just want to stay there. They're lazy. But don't buy the lie. Say that. Admit it. It's easier to be the way you are. It's easier. But don't say that that's the way you have to be. And that, says Rabbi Chasman, is one of the messages of Vayakom Melech Hadash. It's a different take on the story. He forces us not only to see it as the Jewish people, how we were sort of duped and fooled and exploited. He says it's a question or an understanding of human nature and the ability of people to develop mindsets. And for whatever reason, those mindsets set in. But if mindset sets in one way, it can also set in the other way. Interesting idea. It's an opening idea in terms of the power of human perspective and change. Staying in Perek Aleph, I want to move to a pasuk that's probably well known, the story of the midwives. So, of course, as we know, Paro, in an attempt to control what seems to be this explosion of births in Egypt, Jewish babies being born everywhere. Gemara says, Chachamim say that babies were born like 6 in every birth. The explosion was obviously assisted by some sort of divine protection. And so babies were being born at an alarming rate, and the population explosion was scaring the Egyptians to the point that Paro felt that one of the only ways he could control this and prevent what he feared was a sort of inner revolution, rebellion that would expel native Egyptians. He thought, according to the way Torah describes it, that the Jewish population in Egypt sought, or is going to seek, to capture the country and to settle it and to rule over Egypt. And of course, that was never the goal. Yaakov's dream and then Yosef's dream was to ultimately return to the land of Israel, land of Canaan. But apparently Paro didn't either believe that or didn't know that. And in order to protect the Egyptian culture, the Egyptian community, what he needed to do was to subjugate the threat. And so one of the strategies to do that was to kill the baby population, the male baby population. The males, of course, being seen as those who would ultimately maybe bear arms and be amongst the frontline soldiers in this eventual apocryphal battle, Jew versus Egyptian. And so he tells the me'aldot, the midwives, that they are commanded to kill Jewish baby boys upon birth. Pasuk 15. Vayomer melech Mitzrayim la miyaldot ha'ivriot asher shem ha'achat shifra v'shem ha'shenit pua. And Paro turns to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of the first was Shifra and the name of the second was Pua. And of course, that's where he says to them, Vayomer biyaldechen et ha'ivriot ureiten al ha'odnaim im benhu v'hamiten oto v'im bat hi v'chaya. So when you're there, when you're helping the women to deliver, and you see at the birth stool, if you see that it's a boy, kill the child. And if it's a daughter, then she shall live. So just as an aside, just a reminder that who were these women? Who were these midwives? So the Torah gives them names, Shifra and Pua. One of the most interesting explanations, and this is not going to be our Dvar Torah Pasuk, is the Rashbam, who suggested that in fact they're Egyptian ladies. They weren't Jewish. They were Egyptian ladies who were helping Bnei Israel, the Jewish women, give birth, but they themselves were of Egyptian families. So this makes them into, as it were, the Gentile, the tzaddikan, the righteous Gentiles of Egypt. But Rashi doesn't say that. Rashi quotes another rabbinic tradition and suggests that the two ladies, whose names were Shifra and Pua, should in fact be understood to be names of two other well-known females of the story, mother and a daughter. And you probably know who I'm talking about. I'm talking about Shifra and Pua are Yocheved and Miriam. And Rashi tells us, just to take a look at this Rashi, Yocheved and Miriam, and explains the names. Pua, Shifra zo Yocheved. Shifra is the first of the two. Al Shem Shemishaperet et Havlad. So Shifra, where does that name come from? It comes from the Shorish Shin Pei Resh, which means to improve. In Hebrew, Lishaper means to improve. And why is this lady called Shifra from the Hebrew idea of improvement? So Rashi explains, because Mishaperet et Havlad, that's what her job is. A midwife sort of helps the baby, improves the baby's status and well-being at the time of delivery, at the time of birth. So that's why she was named Shifra. The second name is Pua. Rashi says, Zo Miriam. This is Yochevet's daughter Miriam. So why was she called Pua? Al Shem Shepua Umidaberet Vehoga Lavlad Kederach Hanashim Hamifaisot Tinok Haboket. Which means, and here Rashi describes, because she coos, Pua, she coos and speaks and expresses herself to the child, as is the practice of women who appease a crying baby. And then after Rashi says that explanation, he goes on to say that, however, there's even another possibility for Pua, Lishon Se'aka, Kmo Keyolda Ava, and he quotes a pasuk in Sefer Yeshayahu, which basically means that Se'aka is a shouting. It's another form of calling out. Sometimes perhaps you have to sort of get the baby's attention, shouting, who knows? So it's interesting that the name Pua, according to Rashi, is a name that reflects 4 separate sorts of tasks or behaviors that are common for a midwife. So Rashi again quotes 4 verbs: Po'a, Midaberet, Oga, and then finally So'eket. So why? Why 4? When it comes to Shifra, 1 name, Shifra Mishaperet. That's it. 1 word, 1 source. But when it comes to Pua, there's actually 4 separate verbs. So Rashi doesn't explain why, but one has to just wonder again, and this may be a little more of a vort than a pshat in Rashi. Rashi is telling us there's 4 verbs, there's 4 actions. And anyone who's had the opportunity, certainly to want to be blessed with the opportunity to be a parent, or even having not to be a parent, but to be a teacher. And I guess most of us have had the opportunity to be with children in a variety of capacities. You know that you need a multiple toolkit. You can't just try one sort of response. You need to be able to do various things in order to bring about the desired impact or influence or change of behavior or growth or development in a child. And maybe that's what Rashi is trying to sort of introduce. The pshat is, of course, Miriam is called Pua because of her tasks in the midwifery element here. But maybe Rashi is also saying, and in so doing, in trying to respond to the needs of an infant, you can't just do one thing. You can't just do the cooing. You need to do the other 3. And the other 3 also need the cooing. And perhaps Rashi is telling us the need for different approaches and responses. There is not one single correct solution for every child in every situation. And Chachamenu Zichronam Livracha, they clearly applaud Miriam. She's held in high esteem because of what? Because she understood this. Because Miriam does all 4 of these things. She meets the infant's individual needs by finding the proper approach. So sometimes it's the cooing, or sometimes it's the speaking, and sometimes it's the quiet talking, or sometimes it's even the loud talking. And sometimes you need to sort of get the child's attention. But each one of these things represents perhaps a different approach, reminding us that yes, even children need different approach. It's not a one size fits all. Growing up as a child, maybe some of you remember that we had teachers in school that did have a one size fits all approach to teaching. And those are usually the teachers that some of us struggled with, but it's the teachers who understood that there's diversity in the classroom that ultimately become the people who influence us and help set us on the right path. We're now going to move to Perek Bet, and I want to spend some time with you on this. And I want to spend some time with you in going over and thinking about the 10 psukim that describes Moshe's birth and how he was saved from death. So let me first start by just taking a look at Perek Bet Pasuk Aleph. Vayelech ish mi beit Levi, vayikach et bat Levi. What does that mean? A man went from the house of Levi, and he took a daughter of Levi. Vayelech ish mi beit Levi, vayikach et bat Levi. So one of the commentaries on the Mikrat Gedolot is the volatility. And Balaturim, in terms of his methodology in explaining Tanakh, often has two characteristic methodologies. One is gematria, which is based on the notion that every Hebrew letter has a numerical equivalent. And these equivalencies make a difference, and it's part of a sort of another level of interpretation and understanding the text. But he also has another technique or methodology that's often used, and that is he tries to find within the corpus of biblical literature other places where the same word or phrase is used, and often derive lessons that if there's only two places, example in Tanakh, where a single phrase appears, then there's something that the Torah wanted us to understand. If it's in one place, in another place, what message might we derive from the fact that it's only in these two places? What's one story about the other story? What's the common denominator? So in our case, the Balaturim employs this later methodology. And he tells us, he wants us to understand that only twice in Tanakh do you find the phrase Vayelech Ish. Vayelech Ish, a man went. So this is one of them. Vayelech Ish, this is the case in a man who was born in the tribe of Levi goes and he finds a woman from the tribe of Levi, a Bat Levi. So where's the other place of Vayelech Ish? It's another very beloved story of us, and it's in Megillat Ruth. And it's towards the beginning of Megillat Ruth. And in the beginning of Megillat Ruth, the Torah describes yet another man who went. Vayelech Ish. In our story, it's Amram, although his name is not identified in the pasuk itself. Vayelech Ish. But in the story of Ruth, it's actually Elimelech. So you remember the beginning of the story of Ruth. Elimelech is married to Naomi. He has two sons. There's a famine in Beit Lechem where he apparently occupied an important position, a social status position, according to Chazal. In fact, not only was he wealthy, but he was like a shofet, he was a ruler. And as the result of the famine, he takes his family, he uproots himself. They leave Beit Lechem, they leave Israel, and they go to the territory of Moab. Vayelech Ish. And the Ba'alaturim tells us this is the second place in Tanakh where Vayelech Ish is mentioned. Now, in that second place of Vayelech Ish, how does the story end? Well, the story ends in a sort of dramatic way, doesn't it? We're not going to go through all of 4 chapters of Megillat Ruth. We know the story. Elimelech dies there. His 2 sons die there. Naomi comes back with one of her daughter-in-laws. The daughter-in-law's name is Ruth. Ruth converts to Judaism. She ends up marrying Boaz, who was a relative of Naomi all along. They get married. They have a child. And this child becomes the ancestor of David HaMelech. And of course, David HaMelech becomes the ancestor of the Mashiach. So the story of Vayelech Ish in Megillat Ruth is a story of how it turned out that he left Elimelech, but the story ends this way. Let's go back to the Balaturim in his message. So the association that's drawn between this Jewish man in our parak, who turns out to be Amram, and his wife, who turns out to be Yocheved, who's also from Shevet Levi, according to the Balaturim, has to be compared to the other one. In what way? So the story here of Moab, of Elimelech, is in sharp contrast to what's going on here. Rashi cites from Chachamenu Zichronam Libracha in our Parshat Shemot that Amram and Yocheved had previously been married. Amram to each other. Amram and Yocheved had, and we're going to come back to this in a couple of moments. Amram and Yocheved had been previously married, but Amram decided to divorce his wife. Amram divorced Yocheved. Why? Because once he heard of Paro's edict that all the baby boys should be thrown into the river, he couldn't take upon himself the responsibility of living a normal life, an intimate life, a sexual life with his wife, and her getting pregnant and giving birth to a boy who was going to be drowned or killed. And he would be responsible for that. he would be responsible, along with his wife, of bringing a neshama into the world that would be murdered at the hands of the ruthless and savage, oppressing rulers, the Egyptians. He couldn't do it until his daughter Miriam came to him and said, "Abba, what you're doing is worse than Paro." Paro made an edict which essentially said only the baby boys had to be put to death. But by virtue of the fact that you divorced mom and you no longer live as a husband and wife, then there's no chance for not only the boy, but not even for a girl. Your decree is twice as harsh. You basically cut off the future of the Jewish people, not because of the baby boy will be dead, because there's not going to be any girls either. So your decree is unacceptably harsh. This was apparently a shocking sort of revelation that Amram never thought about. And he went back, which is the verse right here. Vayelech ish mibeit Levi. He went and he remarried his wife. He remarried Yocheved for the purposes of, again, reestablishing a normal life and hopefully counting on God's Yeshua to prevent anything from happening. So that was a very bold act of courage and leadership on his part, on the part of Amram, to say, look, what I'm going to be doing is be sending a very strong message. And don't forget, Amram was not simply just a little laborer. He was himself a significant leader in the Jewish community. So when he goes ahead and marries Yocheved for the second time, he's basically sending a signal and saying, anybody who emulated what I did, any man who divorced his wife as I had done, should now do what I am doing and remarry. This is the right way. This is the right way. I've changed. I've listened to my daughter. This is the right way. That was a pretty bold move. So now we take a look at that. A bold move of leadership. It's a move that's intended to sort of implant emunah, bitachon. The future is going to be okay, not without suffering, but we will prevail. That's the ultimate message that Amram and Yocheved gave to the Jewish people. Now we can take that and go back to Megillat Ruth. Elimelech left town, demoralized everybody in the community, demoralized them. Can you imagine waking up and finding out that the man who's leading the community, the wealthiest man in town, picked up and ran away and left everybody there, family, neighborhood, and friends, to fend for themselves? You can just imagine how heartbroken and how confused everybody in Beit Lechem was. That's what he did. So instead of stepping up like Amram and Yocheved did, Elimelech, and Naomi had no choice but to follow him, left and actually settled in the territory of an enemy of the Jewish people, of Moab. So Elimelech's move to Moab reflected the exact opposite of the mindset of Amram and Yocheved. So what we have here, I think the Volatility is saying, so as a result of the first going, which is of Moshe, Amram, and Yocheved, a Goel came, the Redeemer, the man who ultimately brought Bnei Israel out of Mitzrayim, of course, God's help, it's clear, was born. And the final one, who is Mashiach, is also going to come, but from a different sort of side of the Vayelech. So Amram's determination can inspire other people during a time of crisis, whereas Elimelech's act of desperation can make people feel hopeless and helpless and despondent. And so maybe the Baal Turim is teaching us that whether we see Amram or Elimelech, whether the people around us are displaying strength or resolve or acting in despair, we have a job to do. We cannot be the people who act like Elimelech. We have to be the Amrams. Not always easy. It's really not always easy. And I think in some ways, we're living at a time right now where being the Amram, it seems hard. Because I think all of us are feeling a little weary. Maybe that's what Amram was feeling like. Maybe now we have an understanding a little bit more, just a tiny bit more, of what it means to feel defeated and not sure, and a little bit without having the means to overcome. Possibly just a little glimpse into that. But I want to take this analysis of this story a little bit deeper. It's a fascinating story, 10 psukim. So you know the story. I just want to tell it over again. So Amram and Yocheved do get married, and Yocheved does get pregnant. And she has a preemie. She's pregnant with a baby, and she doesn't carry him full term. She carries him to 6 months, and then the baby's born. Now, apparently, according to our understanding of rabbinic texts, the Egyptians had set out these patrols that kept an eye on the pregnant women. And when they calculated that it was time for the mother to give birth, they would send their goons, they would send their soldiers to sort of snatch the baby. If they were not able to kill the baby at birth, they would take the baby and kill the baby. So Yocheved had 3 months to be with the baby because Moshe was a preemie, 6 months. But it's the end of 3 months, as the Torah tells us. Vatitzpeneu shlosha yerachim. She hid him for 3 months. That's why we get to 3 months, because he must have been born at 6 months. V'lo yachla od hatzpino. She couldn't hide him anymore because the soldiers are coming. They're doing their patrols. They're banging the doors. They're busting in. They're looking for the babies. And who knows what they're doing? And we don't have to give more details. V'tikach lo tevat gome v'tachmara v'cheimar v'zapet. She makes this basket and she covers it. She waterproofs it so no water can enter. She puts the baby amongst the reeds at the seashore of the Nile. His sister Miriam is standing far away, watching what's going on. What's going to happen to this baby? Paro's daughters coming down to the Nile. She's bathing. And she's accompanied by her maidservants, and they're walking at the seashore, the shore of the Nile. And she sees this basket somehow in the reeds close to the shore. So she instructs that the basket be brought to her. She opens the basket and she sees the child. There's a lad who's crying, but she's overcome with mercy and compassion. She understands immediately. She understands that this baby is a Hebrew child. So apparently Miriam, standing by, jumps out of the reeds. She's probably somewhat hidden. She sees what's going on. She quickly makes her presence known. She goes to Bat Paro. Would you like me to go and bring you a nursemaid from amongst the Hebrew women? And she will nurse the baby for her. Of course, Bat Paro is not pregnant, so she's not capable of nursing. But Miriam says, let me find a woman, a Hebrew woman, of course, who can nurse her. Go. So the young lady goes, but of course she calls Yocheved. She calls the baby's mother. Perfect. And then Vatomer Labat so Vayigdal Hayeled Vatidieu Lebat Paro. So he is nursed by the natural biological mother, and at some point the child apparently grows up. The boy grew up, and she brought him to Bat Paro Vayihila Levain, and he was as a daughter to her, as a son to her. Vatikra Shmo Moshe, and she called him Moshe. Vatomer Kimin Hamayim Mishiti. When she called him Moshe, why? And Torah says, for I drew him from the water. Okay, let's go back to the beginning of the story. So we spent a couple of minutes explaining the significance of that verse about a man from Levi going to find a woman from Levi. So what's the significance of that? So I want to share with you a machloket, two different approaches. One is Ibn Ezra, and one is the Ramban. Now, Ibn Ezra is known essentially as being a Pashtan, which means he's a person who believes that the text should always be interpreted in the plainest, simplest meaning. Does not rely on midrashic sources. But what does the text say? The text says that a man from Beit Levi went and took a woman from Beit Levi. Now, the key point here is it says Vayelech, he went. So when you hear something about went, you have to think, so why doesn't it say a man married a woman? Vayikach ish mi beit Levi et bat Levi. That would mean they got married. But it's Vayelech vayikach. So the insertion of the word Vayelech seems to have a specific purpose. So according to Ibn Ezra, what's the purpose of the insertion of the meaning of the word Vayelech? So Ibn Ezra says this, again, plain meaning. Ba'arim rabot hayu Yisrael yoshvim. So apparently the Jewish people lived amongst various cities. They were all living in one area. They were, as we know from the story itself, there were many, many, many Jews. And so obviously they occupied many different settlements. They had Arim Rabot, many cities. V'chulam yikruu Eretz Ramses, and all of the area that the Jews lived in, the whole area was called Ramses. That whole part of the country was called Ramses. So Ibn Ezra says, maybe the woman lived in another city. So therefore it says, Vayelech ish mi beit Levi, that is Jewish guy living in his city. Vayelech, he went to marry the woman who was living in another city. Plain meaning, right? What do you think about that? You think that's a convincing explanation? It certainly is not convincing to the Ramban. So the Ramban, who often, just about every time the Ramban comments on Ibn Ezra, he puts him down and says, this cannot possibly be the correct meaning of the verse. And maybe some of us on this shiur also have the same thinking as the Ramban. Like, what's the point of this? What do you need to know? How is this adding to your understanding of the story? Just tell us that a guy marries a woman. That's it. That's all I need to know. And from this wedding, well, this marriage is going to be born a baby that's going to ultimately be the savior of Israel, the Goel Moshe Rabbeinu Alav Hashem. Okay, great. But that he lived in one city, he walked from here to Hashavua. Like, who cares? Who cares? So the Ramban says, this isn't it. So let me first tell you what the Ramban is. And then I want to suggest maybe Ibn Ezra is not given enough credit. But let me tell you what the Ramban says. The Ramban, again, says, if the Torah wants you to know that there's an act of halicha, there's a going here, that means that you and I, as intelligent, critical thinking readers, have to understand why is that fact added, not because he lives in one city and she lives in another city. That doesn't matter to our understanding of the text. But there's something about this that does matter. And this has to do with what I spoke to you before, which is a Gemara Masechet Sota, that the act of the man going to get his wife is actually a point of insertion, because there's something about that act that you need to know, that this was a deliberate, measured act. This isn't the first marriage. This is the second marriage. Because, and here comes the Gemara that I just told you about, and the Rambam goes to explain it, because of the edict that Paro had said, Amram and Yocheved separated in order to prevent the birth of any more baby boys. Miriam went back to her father and said, you are more cruel than Paro. Paro's edict only affected the boys. Your unwillingness to live with as a husband and wife together is now making it so that not only will there not be a new generation of boys, which is Paro's choice, but there won't even be a new generation of girls, which is your choice. So you're doing twice the harm that Paro was doing. And this shocked him. This shocked her father and obviously set him to do what he did. So let me just ask you a question. After hearing the Ramban and Ibn Ezra, who's more convincing? So obviously I'm getting a little passionate. I'm getting a little more theatrical in explaining the Ramban. But let me go back and wonder whether or not Ibn Ezra, now I don't know if this Ibn Ezra had this on his mind, but I'll tell you something, living through the last 21 months as you and I have done, I have a deeper appreciation for Ibn Ezra now. I really do. Why? Because I'll tell you, it's so much easier in a time of oppression, whether it's physical or mental, to stay put. Stay put. I'm not going anywhere. I can't think about it. I can't even organize myself to think about it. I don't want to go out. There may be people whom you know who used to like going out and meeting and socializing and say, forget it, I just want to stay home. I don't want to go out. I want to go out of my house. I don't want to meet people. I don't want anywhere. I'm just right here. Maybe the act of getting out, Vayelech ish mi beit Levi, Vayikach bat Levi, that act of going from one city to the next is in of itself some sort of act of, I don't know what the word, resistance. Oh, maybe that's what the word is. And I think about, the notion of resistance in the Shoah and whether there was resistance and the argument that took place amongst post-Shoah historians about the nature of Jewish resistance and what was resistance, and the idea that resistance only was the resistance of the Warsaw Ghetto fighters who fought to the death, as opposed to the notion of spiritual resistance. To those people who said, I can't control aspects of my life, but I'm not going to let them control my neshama, my ruach, who I am inside. They can beat me, but they can't take away who I am. And so when a Jew decided that they were going to live a Jewish life, that was an act of resistance. When those people huddled in the barracks to light a Hanukkah candle at the risk of their life, that was resistance. No less significant than the Warsaw fighters, Zichronam Livracha, who fought the Nazis. So I wonder, I don't know. Is Ibn Ezra telling me this pshat because he's just saying, well, it's in the Torah, I have to explain it somehow? Or is there possibility, something here that's even deeper? That when a guy by the name of Amram decides he wants to get married and he's willing to go to another community to find his wife, that is an act of resistance. It is. Because you got to pick yourself up. You got to have that energy to go and do this. And I don't know what danger there was or wasn't. I really don't. But to move from one place to the other and to look for your beshert in another community, that shows some sort of spiritual strength. And maybe that's why this pasuk is here. So while the Ramban at first glance says, you know what? It somehow sort of resonates deeper. And the Ibn Ezra, who's just a Pashtan, seems to be, yeah, come on, it's a shvach, it's a weak explanation, as the Ramban said about him. I wonder whether there's another layer here. And I honestly don't know whether the Ibn Ezra was saying that. But as I thought about this, it occurred to me that maybe there's more depth to the Ibn Ezra, and we shouldn't dismiss it so quickly. I don't know if you're familiar with the name of Umberto Cassuto. Moshe David Cassuto was an Italian rabbi and ultimately moved to Israel, went on staff at the Hebrew University in Yerushalayim, died in the year 1951. He was one of the first rabbis and biblical commentaries who actually took upon himself to counter Wellhausen's biblical criticism theory. And his commentary to the Torah very often points out some of the fallacies or weaknesses that he believed was made famous by those who believed that the Torah, of course, was not a divine document, had multiple authorship, and he wrote a lot about that. Anyways, in his Perush, which was very popular, certainly in Israel, and it's worth looking into, Umberto Cassuto or Moshe David Cassuto, he has a really interesting, I think, extra message that this pasuk of Vayelech ish mi beit Levi vayikach et bat Levi may come to teach us. And what is that? It's so interesting, of course, that what's not mentioned in the pasuk are the names. It doesn't say names. So why not say Amram and Yocheved? Our tradition is telling us those are the two people. So why is the Torah trying to figure this out yourself? We're not telling you. Why not tell you? Just say the names. So Cassuto says that perhaps there is a reason for that. And this is what he says. And I'll read it in Hebrew. Kan mitkavena katuv lahodienu shemeish pashut. The Torah wants us to understand that from a simple person, ish mi beit Levi umisha pshuta bat Levi, it doesn't even say the name, because maybe that's exactly the point. It's a simple person. It's just one of the Hamon Am. Klomar bito yichida shel Levi ben Yaakov. Ein letzayin et shemam. Torah didn't have to tell us the name. Why? Because the Torah wants us to understand that Hashem found the Goel, the Redeemer, from a union of a man and a woman. And there could be here a couple of very interesting points. One, if the Torah wants us to understand, we, the Jewish people, do not believe in the theology of this being, that there's somehow the Redeemer is a child of God. No, for us, Moshe Rabbeinu, who played an important role in the redemption of the Jewish people from slavery, he was born of a mother and a husband. He was born of a man and a woman. That's what it is, a man and a woman. And it says, "Vatahar ha'isha v'teled bein." The Torah wants us to know she got pregnant from him. And she got pregnant at the time that Paro had made this decree. And she gave birth to a male child. So Cassuto, I think, is trying to tell us that there's a lot of messages here, more than one. Cassuto is telling us about the notion of Jewish faith, that even in a time of great persecution, we don't lose our faith. That, in contradistinction to other religious traditions, our heroes and the people who end up being venerated in our tradition, they're human. They are definitely human. They're born of a human relationship. And that's why the Torah wants us to understand the natural quality of the birth of Moshe Rabbeinu. And his greatness, Moshe Rabbeinu, where does it come from? Well, he inherited, of course he inherited it. From where? The man is not even mentioned. His father is nameless. His mother is nameless. So Cassuto maintains that his greatness only becomes clear as the narrative unfolds. It's not something that he inherited. It's not something he was born into. And in fact, interestingly enough, the Ibn Ezra comes up with another explanation, which is worth considering. In the scheme of things, when you believe in the notion of some sort of divine providence, what's the message that we should derive from the fact that the Goel, the Redeemer, who Hashem chose to lead the Jewish people out of Egypt, grew up as an Egyptian in the palace of Paro? Like, why did it have to be that way? Why did Moshe have to have that part of his life? Why couldn't he have been one of the downtrodden slaves who never gave up hope? And we could just imagine all the movies. This young man who was beaten but never stopped davening. This young man who they threatened his life, but he never gave up in the hope of the Geula. Ever, never. On the other hand, we have this man who grew up as a very privileged Egyptian until he had this sort of revelation, till he had this moment of transformation, which changed him. And even Ezra says that was actually almost necessary. Why? Because had Moshe grown up with the rest of the Jewish people as a slave, he would never have been able to command the respect of the people. And it was his earlier years as a prince, his earlier years as being part of the elite status that somehow separated him from the common folk of Israel, that gave him an extra level of, I guess, importance and made it easier for the Jewish people to look up to him and accept his authority over the rest of the people. In addition to what authority was imposed, given to him, of course, by Hashem, but from a societal perspective, sociological perspective, even Ezra maintains, it added to Moshe's ability to be an effective leader, that was part of his growing up. Interesting. So I want to go continue with our look at the story, and this time share with you some interesting thoughts and reflections by Don Yitzchak Abarbanel. Don Yitzchak Abarbanel grew up, he grew in Spain, and he was a courtier for King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. And he so tried to reverse the edict of the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, obviously unsuccessfully. And he wrote a commentary to the Torah. It's very insightful, but it's very long. As a stylistic observation, he writes a lot. So you have to really work your way through it. And usually for each parak, he has like 25 questions, and then he tries to answer them in very, very long essay. But then he asks, in this particular section of Sefer Shemot, he asks some questions that are worth considering. Listen to this question. He says this: what was Yocheved thinking? What was she thinking when she put her son in this basket and put the basket in the Nile River? Now, if she couldn't hide him, as I suggest, as I explain, so what is it that she did that was helpful? In fact, says Abarbanel, this is strong language, she might have been doing what the Egyptians wanted to do. She might have ended up killing her son, because she's putting him not in a pond. She didn't put him in a little bathtub. She put him in the Nile River, for God's sakes, with the tides. And it's a basket. It's not Noah's Ark. It's a basket. So it could have easily have been overturned, and his little baby could have drowned in the Nile, which is exactly what Paro wanted. So boom, fakir. Instead of saying, she could have been the one to kill her own child. So Barbanel says, what was she thinking? Why did she want to be an accessory to the murder of her own child? What, did she really think, oh my God, I'm going to save him? Like, there was no reason to expect that that was going to be the only consequence, the only result. So why did she rely on that? And then he goes on to ask some other questions, and they're fascinating. They're interesting questions. Like, we've heard the story a lot of times, but a Barbanel makes you stop and think, says, is this a smart thing to do? Was this really a smart thing to do? So he asks another question. Why didn't she just keep him at home? Okay, so it is possible to maybe hide him, but that would be under her care. She would be the one possibly able to do that. Now, I don't know whether all of his answers are great. Actually, I think sometimes the questions are better than the answers, but this is what he says. This is what he says. She puts him, of course, at the side of the Al Sfat HaYeor, and the Barbanel says she does that. Why? Because, I'll read his language, because she said, she thought, if I keep him at home, it's 100% sure he's going to die. That's 100%. 100%. Ve'ein od mar mimavet. And there's nothing worse than having your child die in your own presence and watching this happen, because that's what would have happened if these soldiers burst into the house and caught the baby there. וגם אליה ולכל ביתה הייתה סכנה ממה שהצפינתו לפי שעברה מצוות המלך. And she and everybody else in the house would have been potentially killed because they obviously went against the king's rule. אומנם בהוציאה אותו מביתה, but when she took him out of the house, היה ההינצל מן המוות אפשר. There was a possibility that maybe the baby would survive, would be safe. כי לא יודע בין מי הוא האלם. אם הוא עברי או מצרי, ועל הספק לא ניתן. Because ultimately, she said, you couldn't really identify whether this was an Egyptian baby, whether this was a Hebrew baby, and maybe if the baby was discovered, because it would be a doubt, maybe whoever found the baby might not automatically take the baby's life. And he says, that's one reason. Maybe that's what she was thinking. It's always better to sort of bank on the possibility of saving him than on the certainty of him being killed by remaining at home. That's how she figured it out. Barbanel says, there's another possibility here. Maybe she put the baby near the shore. Why? To make it easier for people who pass by to grab it. Maybe Hashem will agree to have mercy over this child and somebody would find the baby and have compassion. ואין ספק שגם בחרה הצדקת לשומו במקום ההוא לסיבה שלישית. He says, and there's also no doubt that she put him in that spot for another reason, which is שאם על כל פנים ימות בנה, that if the baby, God forbid, would die, לא תהיה מיתתו לעיניה, so at least she would not have to witness this. If the baby was at home and she was there, it would be beyond her ability to cope. If the baby was destined to die, she figured it's better that he die, not with her watching this happen. So I see it's already 9:01. A lot of fascinating explanations in the story of Moshe and his saving. Let me just end with one comment, because it's 9:01, and we've spoken about this before. Moshe Rabbeinu, he's our teacher, he's our master. He's perpetuated every song, every kid, every baby who goes to Hebrew school knows this name, Moshe Rabbeinu. Torah tziva lanu Moshe Morash Yaakov. That's not the name that Yocheved gave. It's impossible. It's impossible to conceive that when Amram and Yocheved had this little baby boy at the end of 6 months pregnancy, they called him Moshe. The Torah tells us otherwise. The Torah tells us that it was but Paro who gave him the name. Chazal have others possibilities, other names that perhaps have become part of the tradition, rabbinic tradition, but there's nothing explicit in the text. The only name that's explicit in the text is the name Moshe, and that was given by the daughter of the Egyptian king who had given the command to murder all baby boys. So why not call him by the name that his Yiddish mama gave him? Why not call him by the name that his father, the Yikarei Shmo B'Yisrael, at the time that his baby was born and gave him the name? Why not call him what Amram wanted him to be called? Chachamim say, no, we're going to call him Moshe deliberately. The Torah says his name is Moshe, and everybody calls him Moshe, which is the name that the Egyptian daughter of the king gave him. Why? Out of eternal respect and gratitude to this princess, this Egyptian princess, who might have put her life on the line and her handmaidens for saving Moshe Rabbeinu. For that act of selflessness, for all eternity, this baby, who likely had a Jewish name, a Hebrew name, a Yiddish name, and the Gemara says maybe his name was Avigdor, Yedidja, whatever it was, that's not the name we call him by. We call him by the name that she gave him, because we recognize that when a person risks their life to save a baby, that is worthy of eternal gratitude. That's quite a message. That's quite a message, and it's worth remembering that all of us need to know. I'm not saying we should all risk our lives to save somebody, but being so concerned about how someone else is suffering, and we do what we can, the reward for that may not be written in the books, but it goes on for generations. The Yiratzon, that we have the strength, whenever we're called upon it, we have the strength to understand that if there is a way for us to alleviate and ease up on someone else's suffering, take the opportunity. Take the opportunity, make that special effort, because in that effort lies some aspect of redemption. Thank you, everybody. Please unmute yourselves. I'd be interested to hear your reactions to the Shiur tonight.
Rabbi,
I just mentioned before everybody goes, we're going to be taking a hiatus. Next week, I'm going to take the week off. Next Tuesday night, we will not have a Shiur. So we'll return for the week after. I think that'll be January the 4th. But next week, just a little bit of a break during this winter season. I just want to have 1 week off.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Interested to hear your thoughts.
Thank you.
Rabbi?
So I want to.
Yeah.
What did you think of the Ibn Ezra? The way I spun that. Do you think is that convincing to you or not?
Brilliant. I think that Pharaoh's daughter, in effect, gave him a new life.
Yes.
He thought he would have died. So here was the beginning of a new life for him, for Moshe, and she named him. So in that way, she was entitled to name him.
Correct. And we for generations and generations, we express our gratitude to this young woman.
Rabbi, is the name Mishasihu Hebrew or Egyptian?
That's a great question.
It's
Mark.
the word.
There's debate about that, whether it's Hebrew or not. Even Ezra thinks it's actually an Egyptian name.
It's an Egyptian name.
Well, but the derivation seems to be Hebrew because
Well-
she says Kimin Hamayim Mishasihu.
Correct, but that would mean then the name shouldn't be Moshe, right? If you're thinking about the Hebrew grammatical construct, then it should not be Moshe, because Moshe would mean is drawing out, and Mishitihu was drawn out. So even in the Hebrew, there seems to be some inconsistency in how the name is derived. So that's why some of the scholars say it's likely not really a purely Hebrew name. It's likely to be an Egyptian name that is somehow formed in the Hebrew in a slightly different way.
It's a bit of a combo, maybe.
Yeah, correct.
I
Beautiful.
just, I have I made a comment in the chat.
Oh, I didn't see it.
had
I'm sorry, Dahlia. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. I have a problem with why the Jews, when they saw that the climate had changed, that the king was no longer recognizing Yosef, that he didn't know them. Why did they stay in Egypt? Why didn't they go back to Israel? I mean, the famine was over. What kept them there?
So my feeling is this, is that it wasn't just the famine that kept them out of Israel. It was the fulfillment of the prophecy of the Brit Bein B'Tarim given to Abraham, that they had to stay in Egypt. And when Yosef died, Bakod Yivkod, he said there will be a redemption. And I think the people were waiting for that redemption, meaning they knew that something had to happen as the harbinger of the time to return. And just the fact that Paro was now promulgating evil decrees, they did not see that as necessarily the sign that it's time to go back. That wasn't an act of redemption. They were waiting for their quote unquote redeemer. So I think that they were waiting for that, as well as obviously the famine was over. And here's the other part of it, which I do think is probably true, and others talk about this. Their mentality had changed. Meaning, in next week's Parsha, the Sfas Emes has a very powerful explanation of what we have come to know is the reason we have 4 cups of wine at the Seder, the Arba Lashonot Geula, Volatility, Volatility, V'Ga'alti, V'Lakachti. So the Sfas Emes explains what's the difference between Volatility, V'Hitzalti. So I'm not going to go into the whole thing now, maybe, but here's the point. The point is, you need to know you're enslaved in order to want to leave. They had so been influenced by their Egyptian experience that they accepted it. They accepted who they were and what they were, and that they were slaves, and that sort of the dream of leaving had been whittled away and had been taken from them. And their vision of being a free nation back in Israel wasn't part of their thinking. So not only was there no official redemption in the sign of it, they themselves, in fact, Moshe Rabbeinu says to God, they're not going to believe me. And why should they be meriting? Look how they're arguing with each other back and forth. So there's some sort of description of the deterioration of the community itself and its spiritual level that prevented them from ever seeing themselves other than what they were.
Right.
Terrible description.
Correct.
Rabbi, are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I guess for next week, if you're not going to be here, I'm going to ask a question that I often think about. I used to be concerned about it many years ago. Maybe there certainly is an updating on it because I haven't been following it since I myself have stopped teaching. When one knows the whole story of the Jews being slaves in Egypt and the whole issue of Yetziat Mitzrayim, the miraculous division of the waters, this was a phenomenal event. And yet, through the centuries, we have not found maybe there's more. I want to know if you know more recent research. From the time that I had been searching for it, there's never been any archaeological evidence of the Jews having been slaves in Egypt, despite the Jewish religion having as such a pivotal characteristic of their history, having been slaves in Egypt. We have so much
It's
repetition.
an important question, Sharon. I'm not sure I'm able to answer it all, but I don't know if I agree with your assumption that there's no evidence.
No, there might
Egyptian.
be. I'm very ignorant now. I haven't kept up, but
So,
is there evidence
I think there is.
more
So,
recently?
yeah, so you know what? Let me respond to that, not tonight, because I want to be able to do a little bit more specific references to
Okay.
that. You know who has some interesting writings on that is Rabbi Dr. and I can't remember his first name, Berman. He's on staff at I think Bar Ilan. He's an archaeologist as well as a biblical historian, and I think he's written
Oh,
things. I can't remember his first. Does anybody remember his first name, Berman? I just can't remember it now. I'm sorry. Anyways, so I think he's written some things where he's pointed out the references to Egyptian culture in the Torah, as well as taking a look at some Egyptian art and how that art reflects our biblical story. So I think there are some things that you can do to evidence that. But you know what? There's also another argument that the lack of evidence doesn't necessarily point to the lack of the veracity of our biblical account. So I don't know whether the argument from silence is a powerful one. Now we haven't found anything doesn't necessarily mean that it isn't true.
but in the pyramids or in any of the art that, let's say, I might have taught, and I certainly would have known everything, there was no reference to Jews being slaves. I have found.
Why would you expect that?
Slavery.
Why would you expect the Egyptians wanting to make reference, if the biblical account is as it is, why would they want to sort of humiliate themselves? Why would they want their own national culture? If you think, again, we're not talking about modern times, you're thinking in the ancient world. This would not be something that would want to be preserved, that our gods were defeated by their gods. That's not something that a cultural sort of repository would want to reflect. So the fact that it's not mentioned might be explainable by the fact that it's not necessarily in the interest of the sort of promoting cultural integrity to talk about how Egyptian gods were defeated by the god of the slaves. So that it may not be there, it may be explainable in other ways. I'm not.
Well, you have an excellent point. I'll tell you why. Something just occurred to me. In other instances, the Egyptians, how would you say it, erased in certain wall descriptions, like let's say Nefertiti, the queen of Egypt, they erased certain things about her. And who was it who erased it? The pharaoh that came after her, so as to discredit anything she might have been done. So you could be very right in that idea. Yes.
Good. Thank you.
תודה רב.
Hi, Sam. Do you want to say something?
Everything okay, תודה רבה. וסע בשלום, תחזור בשלום.
אני לא הולך לאף מקום. I'm staying in Toronto. We're not traveling. I'm just taking a bit of a week off.
You deserve it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Jewel, I see your name, Jewel Sarna. Was
Yes.
my teacher Nahum Sarna your relative?
Well, first of all, it's my husband's family's name, and
Okay.
I don't think so. My son met with Jonathan Sarna one day for lunch in Manhattan, and they discussed whether we were related. And in the end, they didn't know. They couldn't. The same names crop up in both families, but there was nothing definitive. So my son said, "Okay, so who's paying for lunch?" And that's how it ended.
Oh, well, maybe he was in your family. He was certainly a great scholar, really. I actually met him in Washington. in
You
person?
know, when my husband and I were first married, we went to a lecture. He came to Montreal. We went to a lecture he gave, and my husband went up to him afterwards and said, you know, my name is also Sarna. And he said, we're not related.
That
Finished.
was it.
Wasn't interested.
Jonathan Sarna was a bit more welcoming.
So my
Okay.
friends, thank you so much for joining me tonight. I really do appreciate it. It means a lot that we have a chance to learn Torah together and exchange some thoughts. I appreciate that very much. Have a wonderful week, a healthy week.
Thank you.
And for
You
those
too.
coming.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
All the
Be
best.
well. All the best.
Thank you.